Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and had for many years, decades even. And I am the kind of guy that you can come and ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'll come back to you with a well-reasoned response and a well-researched response, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or any of the deeper lore, unfinished tales, his poetry, his translations, all the stuff about Tolkien that you can think of. Usually it's just like questions about the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, but I cover a lot of different things and have for quite some time. And if you want to ask me a question, there are two ways to do that at this point. You can ask your question, well, there's three ways, really. If you just want me to answer you and you're not looking to be featured in a video, you can just ask a question right here in the comments, and I try to get back to as many people as I can. Or you can, pop by when I'm live and ask me a question then, and I'll usually answer in pretty short order there, especially if you come by on a Thursday stream when we're doing the Council of Tolkien, because then I'll have two other Tolkien scholars with me, Mr. Matt Richardson and Mr. Sid Kemp, and you'll probably get answers from them as well, or at least hopefully a consensus or perhaps a dissent. You never know, but that's another way you can do it. But if you want to ask a question that is going to be featured in a video or may be featured in a video, there's two ways that you can go about that. The first is through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any question really about any topic that you can think of and have people answer you that have the necessary knowledge or experience or expertise or perhaps credentials to go along with the thing that you're asking. And if you ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, after you submit it, you'll be given a list of names of people that you could direct the question to. They may see it anyway because, we look for questions, but if you want to just specifically request a question, you'll get a list. My name is going to be on that list. It's going to be near the top of the list or at the top of the list. I haven't looked at it in a really long time because I'm not trying to compete with anybody, but my name will be there. And you could just go directly to my Quora account, which there is a link to that in the description, and you can ask the question directly there, or you can post it in my Quora space if you'd like to, which is called the Grey Havens. There's a link to that in the description as well. Also down in the description are a lot of great buttons like joining and subscribing and all that stuff, but we'll talk about that later. The other way that you can do it is through the community on YouTube, right here on YouTube. Now, this only seems to work on YouTube for mobile. I don't know why it doesn't work on YouTube for desktop, but all you have to do is there's a little video here. You bring up your YouTube, your mobile device, you go to the YouTube app. On my channel, you just click join the community, and then you can post a question there. Keep in mind that I will consider each post to be single question, so don't put multiple questions into a single post. If you have several questions, consider spacing them out. The reason that I ask that is so that I can consider a post done and answered, and I don't have to come back to it, because you might have two questions, and one I can answer right away off the top of my head, and just write you out a really good answer, without thinking too much. And sometimes I was like, okay, I have to think about that. I have to do some research, or I have to really, really get into the nitty gritty, or perhaps it's something that I just want to wait, So just that's the only favor I ask you. Also, we do quizzes here. I've been posting a single quiz a day, multiple choice, regarding Tolkien's works on the community tab. So if you're a subscriber, which, by the way, subscribe if you haven't already, and then click the bell and do all that stuff. You'll notice those coming through your feed. They're just for fun. And at the end of this video, we're going to review the quizzes from the previous week or so, and just sort of say, look at who got what right, and well, not who, but how many people got each one right, and sort of, just get my thoughts on that and explain the answers as well. But anyway, we're going to start with a reading, and I decided to read from Unfinished Tales today because I was thinking a bit on the Istari, or that is to say the wizards. Now, And this book, this particular actual copy of Unfinished Tales, it doesn't have the dust jacket. I took the dust jacket off because it was in such bad shape. This has been through a lot of moves, and it's been with me for a really long time. And unlike my copies of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it didn't have like a box set thing to protect it, you know. So it's been through a lot, and I just decided to take the dust jacket off. But this was my first journey into not only just reading Tolkien, but studying Tolkien, because I started reading, very young. And it was sort of interesting to find out, that I started reading when I was 4, and it was interesting when I went into kindergarten to find out that many of the children there weren't yet reading, and I thought, well, that's strange. Why not? And I guess it's just because their parents hadn't, taken the time to teach them to read. And I always, very grateful to my parents for teaching me to read very early. And I think that kids are capable of reading much younger than people think they are, I think they're very capable. And Tolkien thought that too, by the way. Anyway, I read The Hobbit when I was in the 3rd grade. It wasn't an assigned book. It was part of an independent reading exercise. And I was reading a lot of science fiction, and then my mother gave me a copy of The Hobbit, which she had not read, but she was very fond of The Lord of the Rings. She hadn't read The Hobbit, and I read The Lord of the Rings a bit later, and I was very interested, that this is like a sequel. It has some of the same characters. It starts off with Bilbo and Gandalf's there, and Elrond's in it and such, and you get a lot of mentions of the previous adventures and the previous characters, and you find out what happened to them all, which isn't always a happy thing. I was watching The Fellowship of the Ring, the film version, with my mother the other day, and we had the Balin's tomb scene on, and like I said, she had never read The Hobbit, but she'd read The Lord of the Rings, and she'd seen the films many times, and her familiarity with The Hobbit is really the Peter Jackson films, which is a poor representation, but I brought it up. I said, this scene hits kind of different having seen The Hobbit, doesn't it? And she says, yeah, it really does, because you know who Balin is, But anyway, I was always fascinated with Gandalf. Gandalf was one of my favorite characters as a young boy, and he was a big favorite in The Hobbit, and then going into the Lord of the Rings, and then, of course, in The Fellowship of the Ring in Book 2, he dies, and then he returns in Book 3, and it's sort of really interesting that he sort of just explains, yeah, I died, and I was sent back, and then it becomes, well, who sent him back? Why, where can we find information on this? And in the appendix, it mentions that the wizards are also called Istari. And now I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. There's a little bit about the Istari in the appendix, and this is where you sort of learn that they're not what people would typically call wizards, which is people with a lot of wisdom or mages, so to speak. People have learned a lot of magic and, live long lives because they're magical. And that they're actually something different. And the first time that I came into the realization that they are, in fact, angelic in nature is from this book, and I'm going to read you a part of it from the Istari. And this is interesting because I found this. It was called Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, and I'm sort of like, okay, there's a lot of stories in here, and I'm sort of flipping through it, or I think I was looking at the table of contents, and I saw the Istari, and I immediately went for that. I wanted to learn about them. So we're going to read this section of this where it really goes a little bit into the angelic nature of the wizards here. We must assume that they, the Istari, were all Maiar, that is, in persons of the angelic order, though not necessarily of the same rank. The Maiar were spirits, but capable of self-incarnation, and could take humane, especially elvish, forms. Saruman, it said, example by Gandalf himself, to have been the chief of the Istari, that is, higher in Valinorian stature than the others. Gandalf was evidently the next in order. Radagast is presented as a person of much less power and wisdom. Of the other two, nothing is said in published work, save the reference to the 5 wizards in the altercation between Gandalf and Saruman in the Two Towers, Book 3, page 10. Now these... I think that's actually probably chapter 10. Now these Maiar were sent by the Valar at a crucial moment in the history of Middle-earth to enhance the resistance of the elves of the West, waning in power, and of the uncorrupted men of the West, greatly outnumbered by those of the East and South. It may be seen that they were free each to do what they could in this mission, that they were not commanded or supposed to act together as a small central body of power and wisdom, and that each had different powers and inclinations and were chosen by the Valar with this in mind. Now here's a note from Christopher Tolkien. Other writings are concerned exclusively with Gandalf, Olorin, Mithrandir. On the reverse of the isolated page containing the narrative of the choice of the Istari by the Valar appears the following very remarkable note. So we return to J.R.R. Tolkien. Elendil and Gil-galad were partners, but this was the last alliance of elves and men. In Sauron's final overthrow, elves were not effectively concerned at the point of action. Legolas probably achieved least of the Nine Walkers. Galadriel, the greatest of the Eldar surviving in Middle-earth, was potent mainly in wisdom and goodness. As a director or counselor in the struggle, unconquerable in resistance, especially in mind and spirit, but incapable of punitive action. In her scale, she had become like Manwë, with regard to the greater total action. Manwë, however, even after the downfall of Númenor and the breaking of the Old World, even in the Third Age, when the Blessed Realm had been removed from the circles of the world, was still not a mere observer. It is clearly from Valinor that the emissaries came who were called the Istari or Wizards, and among them Gandalf, who proved to be the director and coordinator both of attack and defense. Who was Gandalf? It is said that in later days, when again a shadow of evil arose in the kingdom, it was believed by many of the faithful of that time that Gandalf was the last appearance of Manwë himself, before his final withdrawal to the watchtower of Taniquetil. That Gandalf said that his name in the West had been Olorin was, according to this belief, the adoption of an incognito, a mere by-name. I do not, of course, know the truth of this matter, and if I did, it would be a mistake to be more explicit than Gandalf was. But I think it was not so. Manwë will not descend from the mountain until the Dagor-Dagorath, and the coming of the end, when Melkor returns. To the overthrow of Morgoth, he sent his herald Eanwa. To the defeat of Sauron, would he not then send some lesser but mighty spirit of the angelic people? One coeval and equal, doubtless, with Sauron in their beginnings, but not more. Olorin was his name, but of Olorin we shall never know more than that he revealed in Gandalf. This is followed by 16 lines of a poem in alliterative verse. Wilt thou learn the lore of the five that came? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading that incorrectly. Wilt thou learn the lore that was long secret of the five that came from a far country? Only one returned. Others never again, under men's dominion, Middle-earth shall seek until Dagor-Dagorath and the doom cometh. How hast thou heard it, the hidden counsel of the lords of the West, in the land of Aeman? The long roads are lost that led thither, and to mortal men Manwë speaks not. From the west that was, a wind bore it to the sleeper's ear in the silences, under night shadow, when news is brought from lands forgotten, and lost ages over seas of years, to the searching thought. Not all are forgotten by the elder king. Sauron he saw as a slow menace. There is much here that bears on the larger question of the concern of Manwë and the Valar with the fate of Middle-earth after the downfall of Númenor, which must fall quite outside the scope of this book. After the words, but of Olorin we shall never know more than he revealed in Gandalf, my father added later. Save that Olorin is a high elven name and must therefore have been given to him in Valinor by the Eldar, or be a translation meant to be significant to them. In either case, what was the significance of the name, given or assumed? Olor is a word often translated dream, but that does not refer to most human dreams, certainly not the dreams of sleep. To the Eldar, it included the vivid contents of their memory, as of their imagination. It referred, in fact, to clear vision in the mind of things not physically present at the body's situation. But not only to an idea, but to a full clothing of this particular form and detail. Olos, vision, fantasy, common elvish name for construction of the mind, not actually pre-existing in Ea apart from the construction, but by the Eldar, capable of being by art, karme, made visible and sensible. Olos is usually applied to fair constructions, having solely as an artistic object For example, not having the object of deception or of acquiring power. Okay. So there's a bit more here. There's elucidations on passages in the Two Towers. There's elucidations on passages from the Silmarillion, which was fascinating because I had not read that, did not even own a copy at the time. I still have my original copy, which is a tiny little mass market paperback that I had picked up in a little bookstore run out of a garage in upstate New York. And that was this here, which looks really cool because the letters are where it says the Silmarillion are green. So I really like the way that the green screen plays with it, especially that the background is green. There it's blue, there it's gray. Well, I can't go up that high. But anyway, it's really interesting because now here I was as a young boy at this point about, I want to say about 14 years old, and having read The Lord of the Rings multiple times and having read The Hobbit multiple times, and now being able to really sort of study the nature of the wizards, because we're trying to learn here by studying the appendix and by studying Unfinished Tales. And like I said, I hadn't had a copy of the Silmarillion yet, and so later it all became much more clear because Tolkien is so coy. He says, well, we're told that they're, that they came from the West, and he's probably not Manwë, and we have to assume they're angels, or we have to assume that they're Maiar, rather. That is to say, of the angelic order. He was a bit more explicit when he was writing his letters to people, when people would ask him questions. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the thumbnail question too. Tolkien answering questions in letters was really, really important. And sometimes he would write a letter and he wouldn't actually send it, or not all the letters have been published, and we'll talk about that as well. But really, when it comes down to it, Tolkien was coy because he was still going off of sort of the author's conceit that he didn't actually write this, that he's translating. And of course he did write it. And these notes are basically him putting himself into the story as a character. There's J.R.R. Tolkien as author, which is where he just wrote the books. And then there's J.R.R. Tolkien as character within the Legendarium, because Elfwine came from the Undying Lands and traveled to a land that we now understand to be England. At the time, it would have been, just at one time, it was the northwest portion of Middle-earth. It was, the Shire, and the surrounding areas like Lindon and the Blue Mountains and such. And found a man named Tolkien who was a linguist and a philologist and a translator, and gave him the Red Book, and he translated it. So that's Tolkien as character. So when he's writing these notes, he's putting himself in the story as a character and saying, well, based on the information that I have from here that was written by various elves, and there's all sort of conflicting reports, which is really just his different drafts of the books. And, there's some that say the Valar were gods, and then there's some that say they don't. And I'm going to say, well, it looks like the elves thought of them as angels and men thought of them as gods, and then the stories were exaggerated in different directions by both. And, and there's sort of this rumor that Gandalf is actually Manwë, but probably not. Of course he knows he's not. He knows he's a Maiar. But he's like, well, I think we should assume that he's a Maiar, So it's just really interesting the way that he did that, even when writing his own notes, almost as if he knew that, one day these notes would get published. He did make Christopher, his son, the executor of his literary estate and in charge of who, what we'd understand to be editing his work and deciding what would get published and what would not get published, and in what fashion things would get published. And, he did a remarkable job, because we got the Unfinished Tales, we got the Silmarillion, we got great collections of the great works, including even a pretty much 95% complete novel version of the Children of Húrin. I mean, that was much, much later. And I mean, the other ones were edited by other, I think he edited Beren and Luthien, didn't he? Let me grab Beren. I think Christopher Tolkien was still around for that one. Yes, it was the Fall of Gondolin where he wasn't around anymore. But it's the Fall of Gondolin that was... Oh, no, that was Christopher Tolkien. So Fall of Numenor, that's the one. Yeah, Brian Sibley did that. And he did an excellent job. I mean, I'm really just impressed by how good The Fall of Numenor is as a collective work in chronological order of all these different dribs and drabs from so many different sources, you know. I think even Christopher would be like, hey, bravo, you know. You know, and then, of course, the 12... the 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, which, you know, that's like a big deal. And I just, by the way, I just ordered myself physical copies of those. I've always had those like on Kindle. You know what I mean? That's why somebody asked me, hey, could you do a reading from like the Book of Lost Tales? And I'm like, I can, but I would be looking at the Kindle app, and it's not the same as holding a book, and it might look kind of weird. And I did my best, and sometimes I'll quote things from them. But, you know, I always had like these digital versions of those books. I don't know if it was exactly Kindle. It was, you know, it might have been a different sort of thing. But I have, at some point, I put them all on my computer so that I could study from them. But I just pulled the gun on a big box set of the actual book. It's not in 12 volumes; it's in 3. So you'll get more readings of them, especially since I do want to read them on streams and such. But anyway, we have a lot to get through. We have 10 questions. I actually wanted to answer more than 10. I actually had something like 16 questions, and I was like, okay, so I'm not going to be able to get to all of these, especially since people have been submitting multiple questions. Which, fine, don't hesitate to do that if you have a lot of questions. It's just that I didn't want the video to be too much like one particular person, and it seems like I'm sort of favoring them. So it's like, okay, well, I already have like a few from that person, so we'll just hold off for next time. So if I didn't answer your question, I may be getting to it, or I might not. Sometimes I decline to answer a question. There's various reasons why I do that. It could be just because I've recently answered it, or because it's just not for me. Sometimes I'll pass it off to like Sid or Matt or Laurel or somebody. But anyway, I try to get to as many as I can, you know. Anyway, we do have 10 questions to get to, so let's start with your first question. So our first question is, you know what, I just want to say, I've noticed recently there's sort of a trend in the questions that I get. They're getting better. I'm just getting better quality questions, or at least I'm getting far more interesting questions, things I thought, nobody's ever asked me that before. And here's one. This came in from Walter White, who asked me, did Tolkien have scrapped Valar? And if so, who were they? So yeah, there are actually quite a few, so to speak, scrapped Valar. That is to say, characters that were at some point in his writings considered part of the Valar, or gods as they were called at some point. And then they were changed, or some characters that were Valar that were just completely dropped. There are sort of two categories that we can get into here. The first that I'll go over are the characters who were actually the children of the Valar in the early Legendarium. In the early Legendarium, the Valar were more akin to sort of a Greek pantheon style thing. So, you know, they would get married and they would have children, and then those children would be the children of the gods, and were gods themselves, so they were Valar in that sense. And then the second category that I'll get into are characters that were either dropped completely or they were reimagined. So let's talk about the children of the Valar. Now, the first one that we're going to talk about is actually Turin Turambar. And that comes with a big caveat. Turin is the son of Hurin Thalion, a mortal man, and Morwen, a mortal woman. And that has always been the case. In every version of the children of Hurin, he's just a mortal man. But in some of the drafts that included the Dagor Dagorath, which is the final apocalyptic battle of the Legendarium, Turin would be adopted to become one of the sons of the gods. Because early on, the Valar were called gods, always with a lowercase g. They weren't the god, which is Eru, Iluvatar, but they were gods, lowercase g. And that was, of course, later changed to where they were just a very high order of angel. And sometimes, by the way, because I talked about the Astari earlier, and there's this one guy on Quora who just comes by and just will leave me like a ridiculous comment. And anytime I mention a character like Gandalf being an angel or Sauron being an angel, he'll just write, Gandalf is in no way, shape, or form an angel. And I'm like, what do I say to that? Well, like, yes, he is actually. Tolkien said it so many different times. And the guy never replies to me, but whatever. I haven't heard from him in a while, so maybe he's given up on that. But anyway, that Turin is one of them. Then we have Kalimbo. So Kalimbo would actually be half Vala. His father was Melko, who was later renamed Melkor. We know him as Morgoth. But his mother was not one of the Valar. She was an ogress. That is to say, a lady ogre named Ubandi. And later on, Tolkien just deleted ogres. He didn't want them in his story. But there was an ogre that Melko married, and they had a baby named Kalimbo. And then later on, he named Kalimbo Gothmog, and so he became like a Balrog. And what's interesting is that even in this early version, he was the Lord of the Balrogs. And that's not necessarily to say that he himself was a Balrog. He may have just been their lord. Or it's possible that all of the other Balrogs, and there were a great many of them, may have been his children or his siblings, or a mixture of both. We're not sure on that. The next two I'm going to put together, which would be Fëanor and Arenti. Now, I'm putting them together because they're both the children of Manwe and Varda. So Fëanor was later renamed Eonwa, and Arenti was named Ilmare. And they were both sort of just demoted. They were made Maya instead of Valar. And their sibling relationship was removed. We get siblings in the Valar, but we never really hear about it from the Maiar. And we'll talk about, the Maiar in a little bit, about how much we really don't know about them. But some fans like to speculate that they're actually a couple in the Silmarillion, but Tolkien was actually vague. He never really talked about the relationship. I tend to think that they probably are a couple, but we really don't know. The next one we'll talk about is Neoliqui, and she was the daughter of Orome and Vana, and she was pretty much fully removed from the story, and some of her traits wound up being given to Nessa. And then we have Telemachtar. I have a lot to say about Telemachtar. He was actually one of the grandchildren of the Valar, because Nessa was originally Aule and Yavanna's daughter. I didn't bring her up because, she was always a Valar. She's still a Valar. She wasn't dropped. Her status just changed to being first generation, or I should say only generation. And it's interesting because we know the Maiar can have children because Melian had children, but we have to assume the Valar can, but for some reason don't. But anyway, Nessa was the daughter of Aule and Yavanna in this early draft, and then Tolkien had her marry one of the younger Valar, which was Tulkas, and then they had a child, and that child was Telemachtar. So he was basically Aule and Yavanna's grandson. And he had an interesting role in consistently chasing after Melko, even after Melko was banished from the world, which happened very differently in these very early drafts, which you could read in the book, the Book of Lost Tales, specifically Part 1. Part 2 is more the Fall of Gondolin. And anyway, so Telemachtar followed Melko into the sky along with an elf who was named Ingol. And Ingol was sort of a prototypical version of Ingwion. And they would go into the sky and they would chase Melko around, and Melko would be destroying some of the stars, and they would be replacing the stars. Telemachtar was said to be the image of the constellation that we would call Orion in the sky, and Ingil is the star Sirius, which we associate with dogs. We call it the dog star. In Tolkien's early drafts, it was more of a bee thing because Ingil took the form of a great giant bee. Telemachtar has no analog in the Silmarillion, but there are still guardians in the sky. We have Arien, we have Tilion, we have Eärendil. And then the last of the children of the Valar that I'm going to mention is Luthien. And I know what you might be thinking, that Luthien? No, not the same Luthien from Beren and Luthien, but rather somebody who is a great-granddaughter of the Valar. Telemachtar apparently had a wife. We never got a name for who she was, or if she was Vala herself, or what. But anyway, they had a daughter named Luthien, and she was a Valar, or maybe half of a Valar. Tolkien had already written Beren and Luthien. And believe it or not, and I'm probably going to be talking about this on the next Council of Tolkien, but there are 6 separate Luthiens in Tolkien's writings. And 3 of them are in the Book of Lost Tales. There's Avala. There's an alternate name for Elfwine, who's the character I mentioned earlier who brought Tolkien the Red Book. And there's even a name for England itself. This would mean that Luthien traveled to the land of Luthien carrying a book that speaks of several other people who are named Luthien. So let's go on to the next category, which is characters that were just Valar. They weren't like children of the Valar, and they were just completely dropped or changed in some way. So the first is Normora. Normora did some interesting things in the old drafts, but later he was considered kind of superfluous. His role as a herald was given to Eanwa, and his role in discovering the elves was given to Oroma. And finally, his role as being the fastest of all the Valar was given to Nessa. The next one we could talk about is Makar. There's only really 2 things to say about him. One is that he seemed to be attached at the hip with his sister. I'm going to talk about her right after this. And the other thing is that he was so much like Tulkas that pretty much made him redundant. So then we have Measa. She's Makar's more interesting sister. And I think she's more interesting because she's the only one of the Lady Valar that's openly like a warrior, and that she likes to fight and hunt and things like that. I think she should have stayed, or at least maybe her traits could have been given to some of the other Lady Valar out there, but I think that she was removed because her brother was basically folded into Tulkas, and her only real literary function was to be attached at the hip with her brother all the time. They went everywhere together. So if you reimagine Tulkas as having a sister that he's very close to and they're never separated, it sort of creates this ripple effect that changes a lot of things in the story. So I think Tolkien might have been hesitant to do that. And then the last one that we'll talk about is Omar. So he was the youngest of the Valar, younger even than Tulkas. He was the last of the Valar to enter the world. And he's really interesting because he was associated with language and poetry and music, which is kind of a surprise that Tolkien didn't just keep him. Perhaps Omar being constantly cheerful, because that was his character, that might have clashed with the direction that Tolkien was going in, where the Valar would be more stoic and more serious characters. And this actually tracks for me, because the word Vala, we know it to mean power. It used to mean blessed and happy when he had the Gnomish dialect, but later when it became a word that was used in Quenya, which isn't even derived from Gnomish, so it was a complete change here. It became power, so he went from them being blessed and happy to them being powerful. So Omar was a harpist, he was a gardener, definitely a very interesting character, but it seems that Tolkien just kind of abandoned him. So there you have it. That's all of the scrapped Valar, including some that were repurposed, some whose traits were given to other characters, and a few that were just completely just deleted from the story. Thank you for the question, though. I really enjoyed answering that one. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Alex Verlinden, who asks, as I understand it, the Silmarillion was only published in 1977. How did people make sense of all the references to places and people, like Elbereth Githoniel, in the time span between the publishing of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion? So, I would say that most of those references were actually explained in The Lord of the Rings itself. It might not have been like a full explanation, but we got enough to go by, I would say. Most of the backstory that's alluded to in The Lord of the Rings is explained in the text itself, or occasionally it's explained in the appendix. The example here of Elbereth Githoniel first shows up when the elves in the forest in the Shire sing about her. And Gildor Inglorian, who briefly shelters Frodo and Sam and Pippin, is there. And Frodo, he already knows who Elbereth is, and he recognizes the elves as high elves from the west because they were singing about Elbereth. So we're meant to understand that this is something that Bilbo would have taught him. The connection that Elbereth is Varda and her importance is later, when Frodo is in Lothlorien, or rather when he's just about to leave Lothlorien, and Galadriel sings in Quenya, and then it is mentioned that Frodo doesn't understand Quenya. He knows enough Sindarin to go by, but he memorizes the song, and that he later translated it as such. Ah, like gold fall the leaves in the wind, long years numberless as the wings of trees. The years have passed like swift draughts of the sweet mead in lofty halls beyond the west. Beneath the blue vaults of Varda, where the stars tremble in the song of her voice, holy and queenly. Who now shall refill the cup for me? For now the kindler, Varda, the queen of the stars, from Mount Everwhite has uplifted her hands like clouds, and all paths are drowned deep in shadow. And out of a grey country darkness lies in the foaming waves between us, and mist covers the jewels of Carlakirka forever. Now lost, lost to those from the east is Valamar. Farewell, maybe thou shalt find Valamar. Maybe even thou shalt find it farewell. Varda is the name of that lady who the elves in these lands of exile name Elbereth. So there's actually a lot of the Silmarillion's backstory that's found in The Lord of the Rings, and even, in The Hobbit. Bilbo describes the story of the Great Journey as he compares the Wood Elves to the High Elves, and then he even goes into the three different types, which he calls the Sea Elves, and the Light Elves, and the Deep Elves, which we would understand the Teleri, the Vanyar, and the Noldor. The tale of Beren and Luthien is, or at least an abbreviated version of it, is told to the hobbits by Aragorn, which they come to understand the significance of later on in the story, especially as Sam makes the connection between the Silmaril that Beren took from Morgoth, which was later, sung about by Bilbo in his poem about Eärendil, and the Phial of Galadriel, stating that he and Frodo were actually in the same story as Beren was, that they're in the Silmarillion. There are some orphaned references, of course, but representations of the great tales are told. We know about Beren and Luthien. We know about the War of Wrath. The War of the Valar is briefly touched upon. Beleriand is mentioned many times, especially by Treebeard. And there is, of course, the Tale of Years in the appendix that helps us sort of put it all together. It's not everything, but it's enough. Fans were generally aware of the existence of the Silmarillion a long time before it was published, mostly because Tolkien wouldn't shut up about it. He kept talking about it. It wasn't published until after his death, and it was certainly never in any sort of really 100% completely finished state. But Tolkien was a great writer of letters, and he answered a lot of fan mail. Many of his letters are published, but not nearly all of them, and he did often go into deep explanations of lore in his letters. So if you were like, what does that mean? I don't quite understand it, and he was still alive, you could very well write him a letter, and it's possible that he would reply to you. Of course, there are a great many, casual fans who just hear these references to stories of the past or names or places, and they think, well, it's just flavor text, and this is fine. My mother, she got me into The Lord of the Rings when I was very young. I mean, first The Hobbit, even though she hadn't read it. But then The Lord of the Rings a little bit later. And she never read The Hobbit. She never read the Silmarillion. So at my prompting, at one point, about 2 years ago, she started reading The Children of Húrin. But she has difficulty actually reading a traditional book, like a physical book. Everything has to be digital with her. It's crazy. I prefer to have the books physically if I can have them physically, but she prefers not to have them physically. And it's interesting because the generational thing is sort of swapped from what you might think of as being a stereotype. So I lent her my copy of The Children of Húrin, and she started reading it. She got maybe a 25% into it and then stopped. But anyway, I bring this up because even though she was a fan of Tolkien, when she was young, she hasn't actually sat and read The Lord of the Rings for a really long time. And she never read the appendix, which is interesting, but she's watched the movies like hundreds and hundreds of times. And because of this, she's forgotten a lot of the details of the book. So when I'm talking to her and I say things like about the Silmarillion, she's surprised when I tell her that the Silmarils, for example, were mentioned a lot of times in The Lord of the Rings. She remembers the basic plot, but realistically remembers the movies mostly, which snipped out a lot of these references. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I think a lot of people are in that boat. They've read the books, and perhaps they haven't read the books recently, and maybe they've forgotten a lot of the details, and many of these things, they maybe remember them, but they don't remember the explanations, or they never read the appendix. So there's a lot of little variables here. And occasionally it does take a little bit of work. You have to start actually studying things, like I did, when I mentioned Unfinished Tales and how this is how I first started studying things. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have the internet. The internet was like a thing that very hardcore nerds had, and we didn't have that, So it hadn't become popularized yet, and I didn't have access to a lot of this. I had Tolkien calendars and I had books, So there you have it. So sometimes it takes some skill and some work to cross-reference and make sense of these. And this is very on purpose. Tolkien wanted people to do this sort of thing, So that's why it's harder than you would think it is, that not everything is explained. He didn't always want everything to be explained. Even the Silmarillion itself leaves a lot of open answers, not just because it was unfinished, but because it was only ever meant to be an outline of the great tales, and that he would write some of the great tales and that he would leave others outlined, and then he hopes that other people would come in after he was gone and finish them. Unfortunately, his son was so reverential of his father's work, which is good, but also a little bit detrimental to his father's idea of sub-creation and having other people finish his work, because he was hoping that would happen, and then his son was like, we can't let that happen because they'll ruin it, which may have happened, but then again, I prefer to think of it as like the Arthurian legends, where there is no canon, there's just classics. So if everybody was writing, sort of Tolkien stories and adding to the legendarium, we could just decide which ones we really liked and which ones are good stories, and not worry too much about whether they fit with each other. I think that's important. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Okay, our next question, this came in by the request of Time Lord Boy, and I mentioned that we were going to talk a bit more about Tolkien's letters, and here is where we're going to talk a bit about that. Would Maglor be punished like his father, unable to leave the House of Mandos? Also, did he take his own life in the end? Maglor would undoubtedly, absolutely 100% be equally as doomed as his father was. And he absolutely did take his own life. Let's talk about it. We have to remember the Silmarillion is a book of elvish legend, meaning that even in the world of Tolkien's legendarium, it is a book of stories. The elves wrote down their histories and their legends, and in the late Third Age and the early Fourth Age, they were translated into the common speech by Bilbo Baggins. Now, I bring this up to illustrate the fact that while many of the things in the Silmarillion likely happened as they were written, most especially the parts with at least one elvish witness, there's a lot of it that is legends. The elvish religion, the elvish legends, their surmise even, what they think happened. And we are free to agree or disagree with these situations. And Tolkien was himself free to agree or disagree with these situations. And he didn't always agree with what he wrote, because it was the elvish account, and he would say, well, I don't think that's what really happened. And one instance of this happening where Tolkien disagreed with the elvish account, essentially saying, yes, I wrote this, but it's not meant to be taken literally, it's meant to be taken as something that the elves believed, not the actual events, which is an album by Nine Inch Nails, by the way, was that after Maglor cast his Silmaril into the sea, he, according to elvish legend, wandered the shorelines for untold ages, singing of his misdeeds and the misdeeds of the Noldor exiles. And this would mean that even as late as the Lord of the Rings, he may still be out there singing and plucking at his harp. And it's an interesting thought, but it's not what Tolkien believed. And you know, you don't have to believe what Tolkien believes, by the way. You're free to disagree with him. You're free to say, yes, that's probably what happened. But let's look into what he wrote about this. He made reference to this in several different places. The first is in Letter 131, which gives an entire overview of the whole story of the Legendarium as it existed at the time. And he specifically mentions the last two sons of Fëanor being destroyed, in his exact words, casting themselves into the sea and in the pits of the earth. Of course, the sea, that would be Maglor, the pits of the earth, that would be Mathros. The next source is in the Lays of Beleriand, specifically the chapter The Lay of Leithian recommended, in which he mentions Maglor, forgotten harper, singer doomed, who, young when laurelin yet bloomed, to endless lamentation passed, and in the tombless sea was cast. And then finally we go back to the letters. Now, we'll talk about letter 255. And if you look at, your copy of, if you have a copy of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, letter 255, and you look at it, it really just is talking about the poem Festita Colin, which was published as part of the Adventures of Tom Bombadil. But eagle-eyed readers may notice that the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, in the header of the letter, it says, "From a letter to Mrs. Eileen Elgar, 5th March 1964, rather than to Mrs. Eileen Elgar, 5th March 1964. And that actually indicates that the published letter is an excerpt. It's not the entire correspondence. Much of the rest of the correspondence was an attached 9-page manuscript referred to as Concerning the Horde and the Kinship of the Half-Elven. So Concerning the Horde is similar in its composition to letter 131, which is probably why it was not included in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, because maybe it would have been redundant there. And it was here that he mentioned in relation to Mathros and Maglor that the Silmarils that they recovered, that they were tormented by them, and at last they perished each with a jewel, one in a fiery cleft in the earth and one in the sea. And the other bit, which I mentioned, Kinship of the Half-Elven, was a hand-drawn family tree of the related Perithal, the half-elves. So that was also not included in letter 255 when it was published. So the entirety of the correspondence, as well as Tolkien's later letter to Eileen Elgar, was later published in a catalog that was auctioned off by Sotheby's in 1984 for like 570 somewhat pounds. So the references are a little bit obscure here. They're not found in the Silmarillion, but Maglor died just as Mathros did. It's just that for whatever reason, the elves wrote that the elves that wrote the Silmarillion didn't know this. Maybe Mathros's demise was not actually witnessed by anybody, or Mathros's demise was witnessed and Maglor's was not. I got them mixed up there. But and this would explain, perhaps why Christopher Tolkien chose to leave it vague rather than including the lines from the Lays of Beleriand, or maybe he felt that it wasn't stylistically going to fit in with the rest of the story that was surrounding it. So, as to Maglor's fate in Mandos, the fact is, Mathros and Maglor were just as bad, if not worse, than their father. Fëanor, he died after only committing one mass murder event. The sons of Fëanor got all the way up to 3 mass murder events. So I don't think that Nama Mandos was going to let them out any sooner than their father. He was pretty annoyed with them. Although there is, I will say, there is the idea of redemption being key to actual repentance, and it is possible that Mathros and Maglor may find redemption sooner simply because they'll get to that point where they'll actually feel real remorse and actually be sorry for it. But personally, I don't see it happening. I think that they're, like I said, they're probably even a little worse than their father was. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from John Scheidner, who asks, what knowledge did men have of their immortal soul? Given many, such as the Númenóreans, knew of the Valar, and presumably Ilúvatar, why the fear of death? Understandable if it were simply a question of faith, but less so in a world where a group of angels lives just to your west. Really good question. Like I said, the questions have been getting better. I really like this one. The men of Númenor had a religion that included Ilúvatar and it included the Valar, and the men of Middle-earth would probably have heard of them, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Essentially, Númenor worshipped Ilúvatar. At least early on they did, and they had several holidays and rituals, including the king or the queen. They would climb the Menel Tarma, that was the tallest peak in Númenor, and they would pray to the One. And this would be witnessed by the birds of heaven. Now, of course, their faith had been wavering for quite some time, and then Sauron came along, and he made it a lot worse. He steered them away from worshiping God and towards worshiping the devil, Melkorism. Now, the tenets of Melkorism includes the fact that Ilúvatar doesn't exist, and Melkor was the one who created the world, and there is no such thing as an immortal soul. Once your soul passes beyond the boundaries of the world, there's nothing, and obviously that's very scary. So Melkor himself started this a long time ago. He whispered to men that he was God, and that there was nothing beyond death but oblivion. And he gave us the fear of the unknown, something even Tom Bombadil alluded to in The Lord of the Rings when he said, when the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside. Essentially, Bombadil is stating that he was already in the world before the Ainur had entered into it, and that he knew a time when there was no fear of the unknown and no fear of darkness. And men should not have fear of death. It's a gift. We get to leave this world and to be with our Creator, while the elves and the Ainur are just stuck. No matter how tired of the world they get, they're stuck. So, however, when you're a mortal man and the mightiest of all the Valar tells you that you just stop existing and there's nothing after death, and the Valar are to the west, they're not there to say, no, that's not true. Suddenly, you might do anything for more life. And when Sauron comes into the picture and tells you that claiming the Undying Lands as your own may give you the immortality that you seek, well, we saw what happened there, right? In Middle-earth, it's a bit different. The Valar were not really supposed to leave Middle-earth like they did, and they certainly were not supposed to take the elves with them. They wished to live in a land that is untainted by evil and where nothing dies. And they assumed that the elves wanted the same, and some didn't. That's the Avari, for instance. Some did, but they never made it there, like the Sindar. It was said to be the Avari that first made contact with men when they awoken and taught them language and taught them culture, which is a function that the elves were all supposed to share. But we're talking about the Avari here. They weren't exactly happy with the Valar. They were afraid of Oroma. They didn't understand that he wasn't Melkor, that he hadn't been kidnapping people and bringing them off, and then they never returned. So they're thinking that all of these brethren were being brought off to their doom. And this would, compound the whispering of Melkor that other Valar, they're just full of it. They're lying to you. They're promising you an afterlife, and they're promising you that there's a God, and that's not true. So the Avari don't really believe in all that, so they didn't really teach it to the men of Middle-earth. The elves that came from the west were the ones that likely did that. So this is why there isn't a lot of religion in Middle-earth. The closest to any form of religious service that you see in The Lord of the Rings is Faramir's prayer. He had a silent prayer, and he explained the meaning of it to Frodo and to Sam. And Faramir is still a faithful of Númenor, despite the fact that he was born, millennia after Númenor was gone. But he's of a dying breed. Tolkien planned to sort of continue this thread that men were not going to remain faithful with the sequel to The Lord of the Rings, The New Shadow, but he gave up on writing that story pretty quickly. You might be hopeful that, Bilbo's translation of the Silmarillion would become extant in Middle-earth, and it would lead to a revival of this faith in the Valar and this faith in Ilúvatar, not to mention the understanding that Melkor and Sauron were liars and deceivers first and foremost. All right, let's move on to the next question. So the next question comes in from John Doe, who says, we're told that after Denethor immolated himself while holding a Palantír, that Palantír stopped functioning normally, and unless one was of strong will, they would only see Denethor's burning hands when they tried to use it. Why did this happen? Is Denethor's spirit haunting the stone, or did this obsession with it, combined with how much of his own willpower he devoted to using it without being dominated by Sauron, leave some kind of lingering curse on the Palantír? So this is a really cool question. The answer, though, is a lot simpler than the options that you've given me, and a lot more grisly, actually. Now, what was said was that only the most powerful of seers could see anything in the Palantír other than Denethor's burning hands, which, let's be honest, may have been traumatizing for anyone that tried. Tolkien does not specify, who he considers to be a powerful seer, but it's extremely likely that Aragorn is actually in that category, though he had another stone to use, the Orthanc stone. The one that Denethor had was the Anor stone. The fact is that the Palantír was just damaged, and it wasn't working properly. Think of it sort of like, I'm going to give you two different analogies here, one for older folks and one for younger folks. So here's the one for the older folks. Think of it as sort of like an old-timey television, the one with the cathode tube ray, the cathode ray tube, and sometimes you had to just angle the antenna exactly right and use tin foil, and maybe you just had to smack the side of it and go through like a whole ritual to pick up a broadcast from Fox so you could watch Married with Children, and then you could see the Bundy family making fun of, well, you and themselves by saying, everybody get into Fox network viewing positions. And so for those of you who might be too young to understand that, when Fox was a fledgling network, it was kind of hard to pick up unless you were basically on top of the station. So before they had, like all the Simpsons money in the world, and they strengthened their broadcast capabilities, if you wanted to watch one of their shows, you just had to be really good at using a TV. So I've had my fun. I'll give you a more modern simile here. This is for the younger folks. The Anor Stone was like a smartphone with a cracked screen. If you're familiar with the phone, you know how to use it, you know where the icons are, you know where to tap. You could use it to make calls, you could use it to receive calls, but if you weren't familiar with it and you didn't know all that stuff, all you see is cracks. You don't know how to see past that. So the burning hands, they're not spectral. The man burned himself to death while holding the orb. There's likely to be literal bits of him burned into this thing, and it's a horrible thought. But this powerful seer, was probably just the only one who is able to get past this horrific sight that's imprinted into the stones and use them. Somebody in the comments said it's sort of like an image being burned into your screen, which is another great way of saying it, that's why we, on older monitors and many televisions, we had screensavers, because if you just leave it the same, image for far too long, it's going to get burned in, and then you're just going to see that image. It happened on one of my phones once, which was interesting, that a single image got burned into it, which was kind of crazy, and I could just see it no matter what. So it's sort of like that as well. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. So here's another one from Time Lord Boy, and he asks, if Smaug had escaped the Misty Mountains, would he have gone on to the side of Sauron, or being a creation of Melkor, would he have never been Sauron's servant? So I think there's a little bit of confusion here in the question, and I can distill this down to something usable and something that I wanted to talk about for a bit. So let's get the clearing confusion out of the way first. Smaug never had anything to do with the Misty Mountains. He lived at Erebor, which is the Lonely Mountain. It's called the Lonely Mountain because it's a lone mountain. It's not part of a mountain range, so it's not anywhere near the Misty Mountains. Smaug also didn't need to escape anything. He wasn't in any sort of custody or detention. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't restricted in any way at all. He could come and go as he pleased. He just happened to spend most of his time sleeping on his gold. Smaug is not a creation of Melkor in a direct fashion. He was a rather young dragon, and he was certainly born in the Third Age, which is long after Melkor's gone from the world. Dragons are something that Melkor made in the First Age, but after there's a breeding population, they just existed on their own without him having to make any more of them. So there's nothing to the idea that being Melkor's creation means that you wouldn't follow Sauron. The orcs were Melkor's creation as well, and they just follow whoever the biggest bully is. So to distill the question down to the barest essentials, would Smaug ally with Sauron? And the answer is yes. And I know that not everybody agrees with me on this, but this is just one of those things I have to stick with. It doesn't matter all the things that people say. Smaug is proud, Smaug is intelligent. None of that really matters. Sauron is greater, and he could compel, or more likely entice, a dragon into his service rather easily. And this is why Gandalf carefully coordinated the assault on Sauron and Mirkwood with Thorin's quest to keep Smaug busy while Sauron is dealt with. This prevented Smaug from being able to come to Sauron's aid, which was something that Gandalf was very concerned about. People tend to forget that while there were dragons and Balrogs and such in Morgoth's army, Sauron was the one in charge of it all. Morgoth was hands off, and he put Sauron in charge of the war. So I have to tap the sign, and I seem to have a lot of these little signs. They don't actually exist. I just talk about them, and this one says, evil is never cooperative. It's pretty definitive. Never is even underlined on the sign, my hypothetical sign. Maybe one day I'll make these signs so I could hold them up. Smaug would be compelled, or he would be enticed. He wouldn't love Sauron. He wouldn't worship the Dark Lord. He wouldn't even think he's great. He might even begrudge his own service, but that's just the nature of evil. The orcs don't like Sauron. Nobody likes Sauron, Maybe the Nazgul, because they're forced to. They don't have their will of their own. But, they all want to work on their own, but they're always compelled or enslaved or sometimes enticed. And when you have a dragon and you promise him money, essentially, well, there you have it. And by the way, Sauron had a lot of mithril, which is way more valuable than gold. So there's that as well. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Tomislav, who asks, and this is a really cool question, I've never been asked this one. What was the Tolkien fandom like before the films? Did it feel much more niche and therefore intimate, or did you feel like a massive movement even then? And do you miss those times? So, it really wasn't as different as you may think. The Peter Jackson films obviously gave a large boost to the popularity of The Lord of the Rings, but it didn't make a big change to the fandom, so to speak. To put it bluntly, if you like the films, that doesn't make you part of a fandom. And I'm not, gatekeeping here. I'm just stating a fact. You're not in the fandom for every movie that you ever liked. Being a part of a fandom takes a little bit more effort than just appreciating, a film or a book or whatever. So what the film did to the fandom was it added members to an already very large group, because there were people who would say, oh, that was really good, I'm going to read the books now, and then maybe they become part of the fandom. Not every single person, but a lot of them. The Lord of the Rings didn't need films to be popular. It became very popular in the 1960s through the 1970s. Just go to your favorite search engine and pop in the phrase Frodo lives, and you'll see what was a pre-internet Tolkien meme. The films didn't do anything to make the fandom more intimate or less intimate. The big change was the internet, not really the movies, the internet. And the internet came before the movies. The internet let people connect on common interests globally, and thus it became more intimate because you could find like-minded people to chat with without having to, go to a convention or something like that. I would argue that the films brought in new fans, and that's a great thing, while also frustrating, people who assumed that the films were, exact replicas of the book, and thus, if something happened in the films, it must have happened in the book. That does happen. There's another frustration for me. Artistic depictions of some characters have become skewed towards the films. It's hard to find a drawing of Sam where he's not chubby. Frodo was the chubby one, not Sam. It's hard to find drawings of Aragorn without a beard. They certainly exist, but a lot of people draw him with a beard because, let's be honest, Viggo Mortensen made the beard really cool. Short-bearded Radagast, you don't see that. Although I would say that that's such an obscure reference. I would say most people don't even know that Radagast had a very, very short beard. Faramir having black hair, you don't find that too often. But that's just the way it goes. Any kind of adaptation is going to sort of skew artistic depictions. As a matter of fact, many of the Peter Jackson film depictions of the Balrog were inspired by things like the cartoon films. So do I miss those days? No, no, I not at all, because I'm able to connect with Tolkien fans all over the world, and that's just the best thing. So I don't miss the old days where it was maybe you knew one or two other people that liked the Lord of the Rings and were willing to listen to you talk about it a lot, or probably not. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. So I said that we'd talk a little bit more about the Maiar, and then we're going to go to that right now. This is from Time Lord Guy. What forms would the Maiar have taken on the Isle of Almaren before the awakening of the elves? So Almaren was the island that the Ainur lived in during the Spring of Arda, which is the proverbial eye of the storm, as the War of the Valar was sort of on pause at this point. Middle-earth was a massive landmass, and there was a gigantic lake in the center, and then Almaren was the island in the center of the lake. With that out of the way, all of the Valar and those of the Maiar that chose to be visible would pretty much look like elves, if they looked like anything at all. Despite the fact that the awakening of the elves was still a ways off at this point, the forms that the Ainur had chosen to take were established before even the actual creation of the universe. It is said, I wouldn't say they didn't take those forms, but they were established. They were in their thoughts. I'll explain that in a bit. It is said, by a lot of people that the Ainur sang the universe into existence, and this is technically correct. The universe was based on their song, but it wasn't happening in real time. Rather, after the three themes, Iluvatar gave them a vision of what the world would look like. He declared, "Behold your music," and he showed them a vision. And they saw the history of the world, everything that was going to happen in the world, play out in this vision before them. With only the ending was hidden from them because Iluvatar, he's got this strong policy against spoilers. So this was the first time that they saw the children of Iluvatar. It was in a vision, not creation, and they marveled at them, for they were created by Iluvatar alone in the third theme. The Ainur had no input on the children. So the Silmarillion goes on to explain that the children of Iluvatar, that phrase refers to elves and men, and there's a bit of cosmology and such. And then there's a bit of discussion about the nature of water and air and the kinship of Manwë and Ulmo and Melkor's input being bitter cold, but how that still leads to beauty in snow. So this happens before the universe is created. They've just seen a vision of what can be. It was not until after this that Iluvatar said, Ea, let these things be. And then the universe was created by Iluvatar based on the music, but not of it. In other words, the Ainur had a part in the blueprint of the world, but not the construction, at least not yet. Because when those of them that chose to enter the world and live there, they saw it was barren, it was plain, it wasn't like their vision. They had to shape the world and make it match what they'd already seen. So with that out of the way, it should be mentioned that the Silmarillion says the following about the Ainur taking shapes that would be visible to the children of Iluvatar, raiment that the elves would refer to as Fëanor. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by the love of the children of Iluvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after that manner which they had beheld in the vision of Iluvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world rather than of the world itself, and they need it not, save only as we use raiment, and yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they may be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female, so that difference of temper that they had even from their beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us male and female may be shown by the raiment, but is not made thereby. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Iluvatar. For at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought, made visible in forms of majesty and dread. So here we see that these angels, formless, holy energy beings, they took bodies to themselves that they were patterned after what they had seen in their vision, the children. Their whole reason for wanting to exist within the circles of the world. So this lets them be seen and understood by the children when they awaken, which is later, and able to express their gender, because even as angelic energy with no discernible form, Iluvatar thought of some of them as being women and some of them as being men, much like he thought of some of them as being, related to each other, like Melkor and Manwë being brothers. So I think the questioner gets tripped up here by the fact that it stops saying Ainur at this point and starts just saying Valar, thus adding to the question, well, what about the Maiar? And we go to Valaquenta for the answer here. I'm going to read you a little bit of that. With the Valar came other spirits, whose being also began after the world, of the same order as the Valar, but of less degree. These are the Maiar, the people of the Valar, and their servants and helpers. Their number is not known to the elves, and few have names in any of the tongues of the children of Iluvatar. For though it is otherwise in Aemon and Middle-earth, the Maiar have seldom appeared in form visible to elves and men. So the vast majority of Maiar don't use Fëanor in Middle-earth, which is where Almaren was, and they chose to go unclothed and thus invisible to the elves and men. Most of them don't even have names that the elves know, and the elves have no idea how many Maiar there really are out there. This is why if I ask any number of Tolkien fan with a good solid grasp of the Silmarillion, hey, name the 15 Valar, they could probably name most of them, if not all of them. But if I said name 15 Maiar, the name, it's a little more difficult. You're going to rattle off the names of the 5 wizards if you knew the names of all 5 of them, and then you're going to say Sauron, you're going to say Gothmog, Melian, Eonwë, Ilmari, Usse, and then maybe you know about Ewinin and Tilion and Arien, and then most hardcore fans might know about Salmar. And maybe some people might make an argument about the Eagles. Do they count? Do they not count? Assuming that you even know the names of the Blue Wizards and that you know about some of these obscure ones, and you don't count the named Eagles, and so you're going to get exactly 15, but that's a stretch. It's a tough road to get there. So what I'm saying is supposedly there are a lot more Maiar than there are Valar, but we have to stretch things out to name more than 15. Surely there are, possibly 7 Balrogs, but we know the given name of exactly one, which is Gothmog. Durin's Bane's not a name. The ones that chose to be visible on Almaren, and this would not include the Balrogs, would look like elves. And we have Gandalf himself to prove that. Gandalf, or rather Olorin, we're coming back to Unfinished Tales again here, because that's his true name, was said to be one of those shy Maiar that was invisible most of the time, but it was said that when he did take form, he looked like an elf. His only mention under this name in the Silmarillion, and also, it's mentioned in Unfinished Tales as well. And I'm not counting like the index or the parts in the Silmarillion where he's referred to as Mithrandir, is this. Wisest of the Maiar was Olorin. He too dwelt in Lorien, but his ways took him often to the house of Nienna. And of her he learned pity and patience. Of Melian much is told in the Quenta Silmarillion, but of Olorin that tale does not speak. For though he loved the elves, he walked among them unseen, or in form as one of them, and they did not know whence came the fair visions or the promptings of wisdom that he put into their hearts. In later days he was the friend of all the children of Iluvatar, and took pity on their sorrows, and those who listened to him awoke from despair and put away the imaginations of darkness. So, the emphasis here is in form as one of them. When Olorin came to actually be visible, he chose an elvish form, as it is likely that the other Maiar did the same. It is possible that they didn't do this on Almaren, but as we know that the Valar did, there isn't really a lot of reason to say that the Maiar did not. We just must remember that the Silmarillion is the history as told by and understood by the elves. They have a lot of gaps in their knowledge, and the Maiar is a pretty big gap. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks me, do we know why Bain died relatively young compared to his father Bard and his son? So, this is interesting because I don't get to talk about Bain all that often, and he was part of one of the quizzes that I used. Bain, he's a mysterious character, and the details mostly exist in the realm of surmise. So, Bain is the son of Bard, and he's really just a footnote in The Lord of the Rings. We know that the current King of Dale is his son, Brand, meaning that Bain is dead by the time of The Lord of the Rings. But we don't have a lot of information to go on other than that. Believe it or not, Tolkien never gave us a birth year for Bain. The Peter Jackson Hobbit films chose to portray Bain as a young boy during the events of The Hobbit. But of course, those movies, they made a lot of things up. It was never actually mentioned in The Hobbit whether Bain, whether Bard had been married or whether he had any children or anything like that. I think a lot of fans assume that he was single during this period and that he took a wife when Dale was reformed as his kingdom, but that's an assumption. So here's all of the hard information that we have on Bain. According to Appendix B, Bard died in the Third Age, 2977, at an unknown age, and was succeeded by his son Bain. And then Bain ruled Dale from 2977 to 3007, and then he died and was succeeded by his son Brand. And that's it. He ruled for 30 years, which doesn't seem like a long time, but his father Bard had only ruled for 33 years. So let us enter the realm of surmise. The Hobbit ends in the year 2942, meaning that it took 2 years for Bard to establish his kingdom, which is reasonable. He then became king, and he dies 33 years later. So if we assume that Bard died, sort of a natural death from Man of Middle-earth, and he wasn't killed or anything like that, he was likely around 70 to 80 years of age when he died. Let's just use 75 as a baseline for surmise. This would mean that Bard was around 40 years old in The Hobbit, and this actually fits with him being a very experienced bowman. He alludes to having fought in several conflicts. It's mentioned that he fires the black arrow last and that he considers it sort of a lucky arrow that he's fired many times before and he always managed to retrieve it. It is possible that Bard had a family during the events of The Hobbit. It wouldn't be unusual for his age, and it just might be possible that Bilbo either left them out of the story or he simply didn't know about them. However, let's make the assumption that Bilbo wasn't leaving out details or that he wasn't in the dark about Bard having a family, and that Bard met a woman, married her, and she became pregnant sometime during the 2-year interim when he was establishing his kingdom. Let's assume that Bard meets his wife in 2943. Bain is born in 2944, which is the same year that his father took the throne. This would make Bain 33 years old when he became the king and 63 years old when he died. It's a bit young, but it's not unheard of. It's not really as uncommon as you might think. He could have been ill. He could have had poor health. He could have fallen down some stairs. You don't know. Bain is often depicted artistically, when he is depicted at all, as a boy king. He had a short life, he had a short reign, but the facts point to the fact that he ruled for 33 years, and there's very strong surmise that he was already an adult when he obtained the throne. As this is surmise, there is, of course, a lot of wiggle room, especially if Bain was already born during The Hobbit, or if he was born later than what I assumed. But we don't really have a whole lot to go on. Sadly, Bain's son Brand, he would actually have a very short rule of only 12 years because he died in battle against Sauron's forces. But we do know that he had a son, Bard II, who succeeded him as king. And let's move on to our last question. Our final question comes in from Tommy Does Chile, who asks, do you think any of the characters from The Lord of the Rings could have stood a chance against Sauron in one-on-one combat? Perhaps Glorfindel, considering this is Sauron's third body, and we must have been in a weakened state. If we look at what Fingolfin did to Morgoth, just something I was thinking about when reading the story of Fingolfin's duel with Morgoth. Thanks again, love the videos. Now, I normally don't like to get too into like who would win in a fight sort of things, because it just leads to a lot of very silly arguments, and people have their own preconceived notions. And of course, when I wrote this out and posted it on Quora, a lot of people were like, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm just trying to have a little fun for once. So let's have some fun. Let's get a few of the scholarly things out of the way before we engage in fun. While there are likely a number of characters who could give Sauron either a run for his money or just straight up win a fight against him in The Lord of the Rings, it wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't prove anything. He could just come back, as he always does. It's not exactly his third body. He's had so many bodies in the past, though at least one was permanently destroyed in the Akalabath, which is why he could no longer make himself appear beautiful. Sauron never incarnated himself purposefully, nor did he do it accidentally like Morgoth had done. Probably because, unlike Morgoth, he had no particular love for his form. His bodies were just suits of clothes for whichever role that he wished to fulfill. That being said, Gandalf the White and Glorfindel could easily go toe-to-toe with Sauron, but Gandalf is smart enough to know that it would be pointless, and Sauron is smart enough not to fight Glorfindel or even let Glorfindel get anywhere near him. Keep in mind that a much more powerful Sauron, wearing the One Ring, had gone down to Elendil and Gil-galad, though they perished in the aftermath. And yes, they were great, and there's not a lot of characters that are analogs to them. Well, Glorfindel certainly is. But if it came down to it, Aragorn could fight Sauron, Gimli could hold his own, wouldn't win, but just wouldn't immediately get wiped out, you know. They would give him a mighty tussle and probably a few wounds before they were defeated. The big reason it wouldn't happen is that Sauron wasn't desperate enough at any point to attack until the ring had already been destroyed. And he never really knew the horrific effect that the destruction of the One Ring would have on him. Even then, he left his body, possibly because he traveled faster as a storm, but also because he had gotten wrecked in physical combat every time that he engaged in it. It's just not his thing. He's a bit cowardly, and when he does physically fight, he loses. I mean, he won against Finrod, but that wasn't a physical fight. That was singing, and you never should challenge any of Tolkien's angels to any kind of rap battle or square dance or flight. You know, you just don't want to do that, because that's, you know, Finrod got wrecked that way. You know, he could weaponize the Ainur Lindala is what I'm saying. So basically, you know, and then people in the comments were, you know, really crazy about this one. And I said, like, keep in mind, when I'm talking about, like, Aragorn and Gimli, I'm not saying that they would beat Sauron. They would lose, but they'd give him a good fight. They'd go toe-to-toe with him. They would be able to fight him one-on-one. They wouldn't immediately get wiped out. It would be a long battle that they would lose, and they'd probably get some licks in. That's the key thing. Like Fingolfin did with Morgoth. He lost that battle. Fingolfin did not win that battle, but he got his licks in. He hurt him, and that's actually worse for Morgoth because he was incarnated. He was stuck in that form. His body is battered, but he still loved it. He was stuck in that form ever since he took it after destroying the two trees. So, there you have it. Anyway, that was the last question, but now we're going to get into the quiz results, so let's talk about that. Okay, so another week, another 7 quizzes that I put up. I put up quizzes every single day. They're multiple choice. They're just for fun. And, of course, you can take these on the community tab. You can leave comments letting me know, hey, I got it right, or hey, I got it wrong. Just please don't say anything that would give away the answer or even hint towards the answer. Let people have their fun. So we're going to put up the results here, and I'm going to comment on each one and let you guys know a little bit of, why that is the answer and such. Keep in mind, if I mention percentages and they're actually different from what you see that I put up there, it's because I'm looking at them on a Tuesday night, and then I'm going to take the screenshots and edit everything on Wednesday night. So it might be slightly different, but I think this is pretty much what we're going with. So here's the first one. I thought this one was interesting. How many siblings does Samwise Gamgee have? And of course the answers were he's an only child, or he has 2 sisters and 2 brothers, or he has 3 brothers and 2 sisters, or he has 2 brothers and 3 sisters. And unfortunately, this one, you guys did pretty bad. Only 16% of people got it right that he has 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Sam had a big family. The majority of people said he's an only child, and I think, like I said, this is probably informed by the fact that his siblings are not really mentioned in the main text of The Lord of the Rings. You have to go to the appendix and look at his family tree to really get a sense of, what's going on there. But he does have siblings. He does have 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I knew this one was going to be tricky. I didn't think that so many people would go for that. I think part of it is people who just really thought he was an only child, or people who thought, this might be a trick question, so I'm going to go for that. So there you have it. Here's our next one. Which character names Frodo a friend of the elves? Which are choices being Galadriel, Gildor, Elrond, and Glorfindel. And here we could see that the majority of people got it right. It was Gildor Inglorian who first named Frodo a friend of the elves when they met in the forests of the Shire, when Frodo was traveling from Hobbiton to Crick Hollow, and they were sheltered by these elves for a little bit. We talked about it a little while ago. They were singing about Elbereth, and Frodo knew that they were high elves. And there's a whole lot of interesting, complicated stuff to do with who Gildor actually is and who he was meant to be, and sort of, Tolkien changing a few names around, and that can get very confusing. But yeah, you guys did pretty good on this one. A nice majority of 57% there. Okay, here's our next one. What is the name of Merry's mother? We know that she was a Took. Was she Belladonna, Pearl, Primula, or Esmeralda? And unfortunately, Esmeralda is the correct answer. She came in 3rd place here. 43% of you said Belladonna Took, which actually Belladonna Took was actually Bilbo's mother. Primula Took, also at 29%, that's Frodo's mother. Pearl Took, made it up. There is no Pearl Took. I just decided to put that in there. There is no Pearl Took. So actually, I think there is a Pearl Took. What I did was I looked up the Took family tree and I just picked one out at random. I think there was a Pearl, but it was just I'm surprised at this one, but it was Esmeralda. Okay, here's our next one. Denethor's late wife shares a name with which of the following? I didn't want to actually put the name because I thought that might make this one too easy. And as you can see, this was pretty spread out. We have Finwë's first wife at 27%. That would be Miriel, which was later changed to Furiel, which both of those are names that Tolkien uses over and over and over again for a lot of different characters. Unfortunately, not Denethor's wife. Arenian Gil-galad's sister, 24% of you went for that. That's the correct answer. Denethor's wife, who died very young, her name was Finduilis, which was Gil-galad's sister, an elvish princess who fell in love with Turin Turambar, despite the fact that she had once been betrothed to an elf named Gwyndor. Of course, their love was not meant to be. She was killed by orcs in a really nasty fashion in the book The Children of Húrin. The first ruling queen of Númenor, whose name actually escapes me. In my head, I'm thinking, Orendis, but it was actually Orendis's daughter. It was from, I'll bring it out right now, it was from Unfinished Tales, which was the Mariner's wife. Let's see if we can bring that up here. Oh, that's the Third Age. We need to go back further. Really, Eldarion and Orendis. Yeah, they were the king and his wife, the queen consort of Númenor, but not the ruling queen. Tar Eldarion actually changed the laws of Númenor to allow his daughter to become the ruling queen instead of his cousin, because usually it would be a son, or if there was no son, it would be, the eldest male relative, usually a nephew or a cousin of some sort. But, yeah. Let's see. Okay, here's the part about the divorce. I don't remember her actual name. I just thought I would throw that in there. The first ruling queen here. But I'm trying to find the actual name of the daughter. She's only mentioned a few times, unfortunately, but she became the first ruling queen. Unfortunately, she married a real idiot. And then because of that, here it is. The sixth king, Tar Eldarion, left only one child, a daughter. She became the first queen, i.e. ruling queen, for it was then made a law of the royal house that the eldest child of the king, whether man or woman, should receive the scepter. Okay, it doesn't actually say her name there. Like I said, it's not mentioned very often, but I want to at least say the name. Oh, here's the family tree. That will do very well. Let's see. Tar Ancalame. So her name was Ancalame. She married a guy named Halakar. He was an idiot. And he had a pretty good influence over her policies. So she wasn't a very good queen. There were good queens of Númenor after her, but unfortunately, yeah. So Ancalame was not right. And the Maiar spirit that carries the sun, this would be Arien. We don't often see people that are named after the Ainur. They're usually named, men are usually named after elves and such. There was a tradition, where a lot of the men of Númenor and the women of Númenor were named after elves. For example, Denethor was the son of Ecthelion. It was named after a Noldor from the Fall of Gondolin. So there you have it. We spent enough time on that one. Here's the next one. Which of the following did Gimli not do after the events of the Return of the King? And I'm happy to say a nice majority of you got this right. He did not participate in the retaking of Moria because that happened about 50 years after he had sailed to the west, which is one of these. He did sail to the west from Ithilien. He did form a new colony of dwarves in Rohan in the Glittering Caves. And he did rebuild the gates of Minas Tirith. Our next one here, which of the following statements about Elrond is not true? Now, Elrond led a really crazy life, a really tragic life, but the majority of you guys got this right. He did not fight in the War of Wrath. He was really young when that happened, and really not much of a warrior type to begin with. He was with Círdan in Lindon when the War of Wrath was going down, so he didn't actually participate in the actual fighting. He probably participated in saving people's lives and healing people afterwards. All these other things are true. He never knew his true name. Perhaps when he sailed to the west, he knew his true name. His parents must have given him some sort of name. The name of Elrond, it was given to him by, as I said, he was raised by homicidal kidnappers, the people who kidnapped him when he was little, along with his brother Elros. They were named Elrond and Elros because of where they were found. I'm not going to go into all the complicated linguistics here. And the problem of Ross, which is a big essay that Tolkien wrote that had to do with Elros's name. And his wife did sail to the west after being poisoned by orcs. Okay, and here's the most recent one. Here's the one that I put up just like today. When Tolkien writes about gnomes, what is he referring to? And I thought I was going to trip you up because one of these is Tolkien never mentioned gnomes. 23% of people went for that. I'm pleased that's a small number because gnomes didn't come up in The Hobbit. They weren't mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. They're not mentioned in Unfinished Tales. They're not mentioned in the Silmarillion. They're only mentioned in the Book of Lost Tales and his notes and such. So it was referring to specifically the Noldor, not to all elves, not to the petty dwarves. So they were originally called gnomes, and then, he was having his friends read his stories, and they were like, so they're short, they have beards, they're like garden gnomes, they're like Germanic gnomes, and he's like, no, not like that, they're a type of elf. And he realized that this was going to be a common thing that people were going to get confused by. So he changed it to Noldoli, and then later it became Noldor, and then he put that little squiggle above the end later on in life, which became Noldor. But yeah, you guys did pretty well. Not a majority, but a nice plurality of 45% on this one. So anyway, that is our quiz results. We're going to continue to do these daily. I'm going to be expanding them a little bit. Where they, sometimes they'll be about Tolkien himself and stuff like that. So I hope you guys enjoy them. And we're at the end of the video, so here's where I ask you again to subscribe to me if you haven't already. Share the video with somebody that you think might enjoy it. Leave me a comment. Hit the thumbs up button. Do all the things that you do when you like a YouTube video. And consider joining as a member. Just consider it. You don't have to do it. It's very cheap. It's $5 a month. It really helps me out. It's a way of showing support, and you get a lot of perks. You get the cool badge when you comment. There'll be a little badge of Gandalf's rune, and it kind of evolves over time depending on how long you've been joined as a member. You get emotes that you could use in comments and in live streams as well, and you get to see all the videos early, usually about a week early, sometimes even more than that. I kind of ran out of my backlog of members only stuff. So I have to create some more videos reviewing quizzes. I got to get back to doing the reacting to the Rankin Bass Hobbit and do a couple of other things. I just haven't had the time recently because I've been having some migraine problems. But anyway, I'm working on that as well. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for coming by.